In this video, we are going to be focusing on scapula, and we are also going to be looking at the anatomy, definition, and the function of the scapula. But before we dive into today's problem, let's take a quick revision. Let's say here we have a human, and let's say this is the head, and here we have the neck, here we have the trunk of the body. And at this point, let's say here we have the upper limb, and here we have the lower limb. First thing you need to do is to draw an imaginary line which divides into left and right, or which dissect the body into left and right. Let's say here from our view, let's say here we have the right, or here we have the left, and here we have the right. At this point, let's say these are the eyes, here we have the nose, and here we have the mouth. This line, let's call it, or it's been called midline. I need you to understand that anything that is coming, let's take an example with the right hand side. Anything that is coming toward the midline, we call it medial. And anything that is going away from the midline, we call it lateral. Same thing with the left hand side, which is this. Since here we have the midline, if something is coming toward the midline, we call it medial. And if we have anything that is going away from the midline, we call it lateral. Let's take an example with eyes and mouth. For example, let's take an example with nose and eyes. Which one of them is closer to the midline? Feel free to pause the video and try it. In this case, the nose is closer to the midline. Therefore, you can say the nose is medial to eyes. But if you notice, the eyes is moving toward the other side of the body. Sorry, the eyes is moving toward the other side of the body. We can simply say the eyes is lateral to the nose. Let's take an example. And let's say here we have the head, and here we have a freckle. Let's call this to be freckle 1. We have 2 freckles on the face. Let's call this 1, and let's call this 2. And here we have our imaginary line, which we call the midline. Between freckle 1 and freckle 2, which one of them is closer to the midline? In this case, freckle 2 is closer to the midline. We can simply say freckle 2 is medial to freckle 1. When we talk about the anterior and the posterior, let's take an example. Let's say here we have a human facing this side. Anything that is behind, we call it posterior. And anything we have in the front here, we call it anterior. So in the anterior is also called ventral. In this case, let's go back to our problems, which is the scapula. First of all, what is scapula? Scapula, which is commonly known as the shoulder blade, is a large triangle, as you can see from the shape, is a large triangular board which is situated at the posterior. And I just explained what is posterior, which is situated at the posterior aspect of the thorax. Scapula, what it does is simply connect the humerus, which is this, call this to be humerus. It simply connects the humerus, which is also known as the upper arm bone, because here we have the arm, we have the forearm, and we have the upper arm. So the bone here is what we call the humerus. It connects the humerus with the clavicle another name for clavicle, or we also call the clavicle to be the collarbone. So, and I need you to understand that the scapula have several prominent features, including the spine acronym process, which is here, etc., etc. So, first thing I need us to look at is the anterior. This is the anterior view of the scapula. Here also is the anterior view of the scapula. And here we have the superior view. And let me go back and let's take a quick revision. Let's say we have the head and we have the trunk of the body here. We have the upper limb and the lower limb. Anything that is going up here, we call it the superior. And anything that is going toward the floor, we call it the inferior. That is where if you look at this view, which is up, we call it the superior view of the scapula. And here we have the inferior view, which is from the beneath, from down. So here, if you trace the peak, here we call it the posterior. And I am sure I've explained to you what is posterior view. Anything that is behind. And this is the lateral view. And here we have the medial view. So let's look at the features of the scapula. First, let's start with the angles. Notice that the top blade is the superior angle of the scapula, which is the uppermost corner of the scapula. What I'm trying to explain is this side, which is the top blade. This is what we call, since I have explained to you that the upper side, we call it the superior. Therefore, this particular portion, we can call it the superior. Sorry? I think the superior angle has to be here. Angle. If this is superior, what is the opposite of superior? In this case, it's going to be inferior. Here we are going to have the inferior angle. So, and okay, we call this to be inferior, and here is the inferior. So, and the inferior, which is the lower corner of the scapula. After the superior and inferior, next you need to focus is the borders. Borders of the scapula, we have three main types of borders, which is the superior border. Remember, this particular portion, this is what we call the angle, but in the case of border, it's simply going to be here. So therefore, this is also at the top. If this is superior angle, here is going to be what? Superior border. Here, that is this side from here to here, we call it the medial border. Sorry. And here at this point, we call it the lateral. The lateral what? The lateral border. The superior border, it simply runs along, the superior border runs along the top edge, which is at this point. And when we talk about the medial border, it runs down the inner edge next to the spine and simply is the longest, and it faces the vertebral column. And here we have the lateral border. It runs that is in the outer edge, which is closer to the armpit. If you look at it, it is facing the humerus here at this point. This is the lateral border. If you look at it anteriorly, that is this side. Let's look at the anterior view. Here we have the superior, lateral. Okay? I think I've left the anterior. If you look at it anteriorly, we can see the scapular fossa. Yeah, here we are done with it. Yeah, this is the anterior view. You can see the scapular fossa. When we say the scapular fossa, which is from this point, everything here, this is what we call the scapular fossa. The function of the scapular fossa serves as an attachment site for muscle and tendons, allowing movement and stability for the shoulder joint. Here we call it scapula fossa. And here we can also call it an attachment point for the subscapularis muscles. If you turn the image posteriorly, let's look at the posterior view. Okay, this is it. If you turn the image posteriorly, we can see the spine of the scapula. This is simply a ridge on the back of the scapula bone dividing into prospinous and infraspinous fossa. This is being grabbed from the word superior and inferior. If we say the top is superior and the bottom is inferior, therefore this point I'm drawing, we call it the prospinous fossa. So, and we said the spine, which is this is what the spine, it actually divides this into two, dividing it into prospinous fossa, and at this point, which is this, is infraspinous fossa. Spinous fossa. What are the functions of these two? Let's shade it. What are the functions of these two? They simply provide attachment for the important shoulder muscles. Because in this video, we are not focusing on the muscles, let's just stop here. So this is it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you find it helpful.